Alrighty. Well, thank you very much for the invitation and welcome here. As I think you probably understood from the flyer advertising tonight, I'm a professor over at UW. I'm a professor who very much believes in public education and breaking down the walls of the ivory tower, and it's a great pleasure as a result to cross 15th and actually come here to the Common Good Cafe and join you all in this conversation. I hope it will be a conversation. Whether it will be deep, I'm not so sure. I think what I'm shooting for is more broadening rather than deepening. But we'll be able to talk about this. I'm a geographer by background, so I tend to, historians tend to go deep, geographers tend to go wide, perhaps. Yeah, I'm also, I should mention, you can tell from my accent, although I've lived here in the States, and I am an American now, I've lived here since 1994. I originally grew up in a town called Tunbridge in the UK, and thinking about someone with Alzheimer's. My mother died of Alzheimer's last year, and you do feel the distance when a loved one passes away far on the other side of the planet. So I've been sort of had that sort of sense of feeling the distance, and I've been increasingly interested in what we can learn from the sort of caregivers who deal with challenges like Alzheimer's. They can tell us a lot about the precariousness of life, and that's something I want to come back to repeatedly in my comments tonight. I want to talk about precariousness and how we can actually use it to think through the common good. So I'm very concerned with the common good, and I want to talk tonight about a huge social problem that tends to prevent people from talking about the common good, and that's inequality. And it's a problem that's, I think inequality is very hard to address unless we do talk about the common good. It's a vicious sort of cycle, and we need to break that cycle. We need to imagine the common good, to talk about inequality, and then in turn imagine responses to it. I basically want to argue that the best responses to the huge and very consequential inequalities shaping human life across the planet today, the best responses have to begin by thinking in terms of the common good. So I can't think of a better name for this gathering than the Common Good Cafe. But it raises some big questions. I suspect questions that you've been thinking about in many other sessions before mine, and we'll go on thinking about after this one, which is, what is the common? What is the space of the common? And this is where I want to go broad. Who's included? Surely everybody is included. Everybody, everyone. And that means thinking of the common in a global way, I think. And this is also where inequality gets in the way, where the inequalities that divide human beings repeatedly prevent us from imagining and seeing what we share and what is the common good. Now, when we dive into inequalities, I'm going to put my sort of professorial hat on for a moment and tell you a few things that I explain in more detail for my students, more excruciating detail in this book that came out last year on globalization. I think it's very important to address some of the complexities around inequality that are emerging in the context of globalization. My book, it came out last year. It's entitled Introducing Globalization, Ties, Tensions, and Uneven Integration. And I'm going to get back to this question of unevenness later. The problem with, there are at least three kinds of inequalities that I think we have to grasp. There's, first of all, the ones that are most in the news, the rising in-country inequalities that are all around us. These are the inequalities that the Occupy movement made so clearly visible as an object of criticism and dissent and organizing. And it wasn't surprising that the Occupy Wall Street phenomenon, which started obviously as a movement in Wall Street, inspired by the Arab Spring and the other movements in Europe against austerity, but nevertheless started as Occupy in Wall Street, they very quickly spread, and they resonated with people right across the planet. And there was a reason for that. The actual the sort of the recurrent theme of the 99% losing out to the 1% was basically a kind of cry against emerging and extreme kinds of socioeconomic inequality. And you can spend a lot of time slicing and dicing the numbers. It's not necessarily the 1%, maybe it's the 0.1% that are really carving off the biggest slice of the pie, something like 40% of national wealth in the United States and some other rich countries. But the point is that these inequalities are all around us, and they're very, and importantly, politicized today. Kshama Sawant has politicized them successfully in Seattle. I think it's partly why she was elected, because she drew our attention and the attention of people in Seattle to extreme inequality as an issue that needed to be taken on. Bill de Blasio did it again in New York City, talking about a tale of two cities. And these tales of two cities, which obviously a title going back to Dickens's book, can be told in many, many different venues, not just here in the United States. You travel around the world to any big city, and the inequalities are so stark, right in your face. And as a geographer, I'm always struck by how much they're marked in the landscape today. When you arrive in a big city, you normally arrive in a unless you're a poor person, you arrive in an airport. And the airport is like a little gated community. You go outside of the airport and suddenly there's homeless people all around. And this will happen whether you're landing at SeaTac or, as I just did, landing at Indira Gandhi International Airport in India. The same sort of spatial embodiment or concretization of social and economic inequality is right there before your eyes. These two cities that de Blasio and others are talking about are very visible. They're also, though, moving. You know, people move through space in very unequal ways, and that's why I drew attention there to the fact that not everybody lands in the airport. Some people arrive in the city in a Greyhound bus or on a bicycle in India or the back of a donkey cart. And those inequalities in movement also very obviously bring inequality before our eyes. You know, people can buy fast cross-border movement. Some people, like Thomas Friedman, believe the world is flat, but they're able to believe the world is flat because they move so smoothly across the world's borders. They can pay to cross the world's borders through various kinds of VIP crossing lanes and frequent flyer club special treatment routes. Many other people can't cross borders so fast. Many people are interdicted at borders and locked up, incarcerated. Although I might know, there is a sort of a special class of person who's so excluded and who's in a recent American history has been so targeted, the potential terrorist, who have been targeted for expedited removal. And some have been subject to extraordinary rendition. And they have a strange, uncanny replay of the business class experience, because the CIA will put them on a Gulfstream jet, the same vehicle that gives hypermobility to some, to expedite them into a prison for torture in another part of the world. That's really an aside. A big point I want to make is in-country inequality is rising, and it's rising at a rapid rate in most countries around the world. Only a few, like Brazil, have had success in recent years in reducing in-country inequality. But notice the term I'm using here, in-country inequality. It's not a term that people were using in the 60s and 70s necessarily when they were talking about inequality. And the reason why I have to mention it's in-country is that statistically inequalities at another level globally have been reduced with the very rapid rise in wealth and growth, I should say, primarily growth and then wealth for a few in China and to a lesser extent India. A very large number of people in the world have been brought out of a very poor existence. And so those numbers of people sort of becoming more affluent, lower middle class consumers have changed the global distribution of wealth. And I think it's important for critically minded folks who care about social justice to acknowledge that despite many of the problems, which I'm going to go on to talk about, globalization has actually helped some people in some places to climb out of very poor rural life circumstances, particularly in China. But that kind of fall in international inequality is itself unequally distributed. So if you go to China or you go to India, you realize that only very particular regions and communities have benefited. It's a very uneven process of inequality reduction. And many parts of the world are left out of the process altogether. Many parts of Africa, although there are certain countries like Botswana that have seen significant improvements. And so what we're seeing is that at that level is a sort of a third level of inequality. The kinds of rapid growth recorded in China and a few parts of India are not being seen in other places close by, like Nepal or the Philippines. And if you really want to understand all three of those inequalities I've just mentioned, the rising in-country inequality that's very omnipresent, the falling global inequalities represented by the rise in of growth in China and India, and the rising inequalities around the distribution of that growth. If you want to understand that sort of threefold phenomenon, you have to put it into a larger global picture, a picture of growing market-led globalization, and in particular the policies that come with that market-led globalization, which I follow people, Marxist scholars like David Harvey, in referring to as neoliberalization. Now this term is a jargon term of social science. It causes bemused looks amongst students and even more bemused responses amongst the public, I think. Because liberal in America generally is seen to be progressive, left of center. It's a sort of a synonym for those kinds of political positions. But we need to remember the history of liberalism. And the term neoliberalism reminds us of that history. Originally, liberalism grew up as a political phenomena in industrializing Europe. As the business class, as it emerged, the manufacturers emerged and sort of freed themselves from the aristocrats and pushed for the rights of individuals to sell their labor, and pushed for the rights of man eventually. And that was the original sort of form of liberalism. It was associated with early industrial capitalism and imperialism. And it was itself very unequal. Rights in Europe, no rights in the colonies. But it was that kind of market-based liberalism, the liberalism of Adam Smith, was then was replaced in the 20th century by welfare state liberalism. And that's the liberalism people think about when you say it in America. But what neoliberalism is, and that's why the neo is important, is it basically represents a historical return to the market liberalism of the 19th century and a repudiation of the welfare state liberalism of the 20th century. And as we now go into the second decade of the 21st century, neoliberalism, a commitment to market-led global integration and market-led and pro-market reform to policy making, that kind of neoliberalism has become expanded and also entrenched globally. And I think it's absolutely crucial to understand that process of expanded and entrenched neoliberalism in order to understand rising inequality. I think inequality in and of itself is not the best focus for sort of, I mean, it's a starting point for a political conversation, but if it remains the only focus of attention, it leads, I think, sometimes to progressives being kind of cornered by sort of childish critics who say, well, do you just want to force everybody to be equal? Is that your problem? And surely that's not where people who care about the common good and social justice want to be. Where I feel like we need to be is tackling the forces that create inequality in the first place, tackling the actual processes that create injustice, and not trying to sort of just correct it after the effects afterwards. So that means it's vital to look at the processes, and that's why neoliberalism, I think, is a useful term for naming some of the broad processes of market-led transition that are ushering in this era of inequality that we're living in. All right, so where am I with time here? It's about 15 minutes, was okay. So this is where the 3 R's that were in the title that you may have seen posted come into my talk. I think the processes of neoliberal globalization are producing 3 different kinds of responses, both here in the United States, but all around the world. And these are very broad categories. I use them to frame the debate for students in my last chapter of this book, where I talk about responses to globalization. And there, I say that there's a new 3 R's that we need to address. So these are the 3 R's that I think are useful for thinking about the responses to neoliberalism. The first R is the R of resistance, actually fighting against the processes that create inequality. But there are 2 other R's that I think are actually more dominant today. One is the R of resilience, of trying to build just personal survival skills for this hyper-competitive global economy. It's the sort of response that you see parents wanting their children to develop. It's what students in turn at the university want to do. They might see the problems of social injustice. They might see they do oftentimes, but they're also very conscious of the fact that they need to build personal resilience to cope in this globalized and hyper-competitive world. And this R of resilience is in tension with another R that's also in tension with resistance. And that the other R is reaction. When I say reaction, I'm thinking of reactionary politics. And I'm thinking in particular of movements like the Tea Party movement here in the States, but there are many similar movements in other countries that also are responding to the pressures of neoliberalization, but doing so by hearkening back to an older moment that's sort of imagined as the perfect good old days, when a small community of privileged people, generally straight, white, Christian men of property, had what they wanted, and they want to just protect that secure group and defend them from the cosmopolitan hordes, if you will. I'm not saying if that was read as an interpretation of the Tea Party movement, it would be much too simplifying. I don't mean it to be an interpretation of the Tea Party movement. I actually think the Tea Party movement in the US started off as a response to the 2008 financial crisis, and many people in the movement originally were very anxious about financial instability and the forms of dispossession it was leading to, including foreclosures and so forth. They were very politicized about the bailouts for the banks by the federal government. But instead of looking at that as a form of government capture by the financial industry, which is what it was, they tended instead to blame the government itself and connect that in turn with a reactionary politics that was about defending the United States from all these foreigners and foreign interests. That's a kind of reactionary politics. So the problem with resilient strategies and the problem with reactionary politics are key to address for us to kind of work out how resistance strategies can be expanded to include more people and to be successful. The problem with resilient strategies, as I see it, is that they tend to subordinate the common good to efforts simply to improve individual survival and self-preparation for success in a competitive global economy. The problem with reactionary politics, I probably don't need to belabor this with this audience. There's a social justice problem with reactionary politics in and of itself. But it defines, we still have to look analytically at what it's doing to the common. It truncates the common. It imagines the common in narrow, parochial, ethnicist, racist, or hyper-nationalist terms that lead to exclusionary kinds of anti-globalization response, and terms that often lead to militarist geopolitics as well. So the challenge for thinking through resistance in the era of neoliberal globalization, in the era of inequality, it seems to me, is that we need to distinguish it more effectively from the things it gets confused with, both reactionary politics and resilience politics. Resistance strategies are not anti-globalization, as many of the critics in the financial press suggest. Most of the people who organized here in Seattle in 1999 against the WTO were not anti-globalization. They actually came from many different parts of the world. They were anti-neoliberalization, and they were for ultra-globalization, moving towards and broadening politics of resistance globally by being critical of neoliberal reforms, market-led reforms. So to give you an example of how that, I'm thinking through resistance as a sort of alternative to reaction and resilience, I want to take us to the term protectionism, because this is a term that's often used by critics of the global justice movement to attack protesters and social justice activists, to say, oh, you're just a bunch of old-fashioned protectionists. You're not interested in the opportunities of a globally integrated world. And I think this misses the point completely, because what global justice movement leaders are arguing for is a different kind of protection, not a reactionary, nationalistic kind of protection of a domestic economy and its industries and its businesses, but rather a protection of people, a protection of the environment, protection of workers. That's the kind of protection I'm talking about, and it's not nationally territorialized. It's a global kind of protection. It's an imagination of the common in global terms. There's just that one word, protectionism, can therefore, you can see how it can be taken in at least two different directions. And if we think of resistance in juxtaposition to a reactionary kind of nationalistic protectionism, it helps us distinguish the strategy of resistance. And it certainly is an alternative to a strategy of resilience that's all about how do we make the most for ourselves, whoever the selves are, from the processes of trade liberalization. Now, for all the sort of main political policy reforms of neoliberalism, I think we can chart both a social justice, alter globalization, resistance strategy response that's about challenging inequalities and the processes that create them. And we can also see anti-globalization reactionary responses. So let me just give you a few examples of this. I talk in my book about the 10 commandments of neoliberalism, but not in a biblical sense at all. But they are like a bunch of policy rules that have been declared from on high that most of the world is increasingly embracing and locking into place. So what are they? That trade liberalization is one of them. Privatization of public services is a second. Third is the deregulation of business. Fourth is the cutting of public spending. A fifth is the flattening or reduction of redistributive taxes. The sixth is the enticing of foreign investment, a constant pursuit of foreign direct investment. The seventh is a struggle against unions and a demand for flexibility in the workplace. Eight is the encouragement of export-led growth. 9 is constant focus on reducing inflation. And 10 is the enforcement of property rights around the world. That's your 10 commandments of neoliberalism. And it's so familiar. I mean, you probably didn't hear someone call them the 10 commandments before, but it's so familiar. You know all of them. It's like politics for dummies. Pretty much everybody who's grown up over the last 20 years knows those rules, because that's pretty much what most politicians have learnt as like the new normal. That's good policy making. But against all of those, there's both a sort of a strategy of resistance and a strategy of reaction. Whereas the reactionaries would be in favor of nationalist protectionism. Resistance strategies are focused on fair trade and workers' rights. Whereas reactionaries' response to the privatization of public services is to limit access to public services that remain, to say migrants don't get those public services, although those people don't get those public services. The resistance strategy is instead of course, to argue that we need to protect and expand public services. Instead of deregulating business, the reactionaries want sometimes to subsidize very particular national businesses, weapons manufacturers or big agricultural firms, being two notable examples in the United States. Critics want to re-regulate business globally. I think, in the interest of time, I won't go through my whole list. I can do it more in questions. Do you want me to go through my whole list?
Yes.
Yeah? All right. Okay. I'm realizing it's taking me longer than I anticipated.
You should be a preacher.
Someone once said that to me. So instead of flattening taxes and constantly trying to reduce them, a resistance strategy has to involve redistributing wealth through fair taxation policies. And that has to be a collective project to justify it. And the taxes then have to be spent on things that are democratically agreed on as priorities. The reactionary response is sometimes in favor of taxes, but most of the time the revenue is going to be targeted at very particular interests, not least of all the military. Instead of constantly focusing on enticing foreign direct investment, alter globalization strategies have talked about things like taxing foreign exchange movements, the so-called Robin Hood tax or the Tobin tax that would place a small tax on financial transfers to raise revenue that could in turn be used for protecting and expanding public services. The reactionary response to the constant neoliberal chasing of foreign direct investment is to just say, buy national, buy our own country's goods, with fairly naive understandings of where all the component parts have ever come from. So everything is so integrated now. The production of pretty much any commodity has got components coming from so many parts of the world. Buying national hardly makes any sense at all. Instead of the fight against unions, ultra-globalization strategies focus on global worker solidarity, and not just solidarity between unions, but between unions and their communities. Of course, the reactionary response is simply to fight socialism and fight unions in the name of fighting socialism. Instead of constantly focusing on export-led growth, the ultra-globalization movement in recent years has talked more and organized more around local food security and environmental sustainability. And instead of that, the reactionary response seems to be just let's exploit protected natural environments in the name of energy independence. Instead of the constant neoliberal struggle against inflation and what Paul Krugman has referred to quite funnily and usefully as sadomonetarism, that the sort of vision that price stability can be used as this sort of like whip all the time. The ultra-globalization movement is strongly in favor of debt relief and real aid. And interestingly, the reactionary response to the threat of inflation is, I mean, they're even more paranoid about inflation than anybody else. And so, but they've actually been preyed upon themselves, it seems to me. If you watch a Glenn Beck show, you'll see someone like Schiff come on there, who's one of the economic advisors that he has occasionally, and he'll be saying, buy gold, you know, because the dollar's going to die because they're borrowing too much and they're doing quantitative easing. The other kind of reactionary preoccupation is that debtors should always be made accountable and they should be punished for their debts if they don't pay them back. Finally, in the face of the neoliberal commitment to constant expansion of property rights, the patenting of everything, the titling of land, common lands across the planet, ultra-globalization activists have shown how we need to focus on freeing up common property for the common good. And that means also freeing up science from the machinery of patenting and privatization of scientific innovation, and particularly freeing up access to essential medicines so that they are not limited in who they can benefit by privately held monopolistic patents. The reactionary response on property rights is let's just defend them with military means if necessary. And scientists, meanwhile, are held in constant suspicion. So there you have my sort of juxtapositions of reaction and resistance against neoliberalism. What I see amongst my students at UW, though, is a constant. They're not. Most students are not drawn to reactionary responses, but what they are drawn towards is strategies of resilience. Understandably, you know, living in very precarious times. And so I struggle as an educator to think, and this is where I'm going to sort of move to some questions for us to deliberate collectively. I'm interested in how we get people to move from thinking about their personal precariousness to thinking about solidarity with distant strangers. How can we move from an awareness of what some social theorists call precarity to solidarity? So how do we move from precarity to solidarity? Two people that I want to mention as inspirations for me in this respect are Guy Standing, who is a scholar at the International Labour Organization for some time, written a book on the global precariat, not the proletariat, but the precariat, saying that today we're not seeing a simple kind of class bifurcation of a globalized working class and a managerial bourgeoisie, but rather a globalized precariousness running through labor markets everywhere. You may have a secure job one day with pensions and benefits and a decent pay, but the next day financial volatility, the buyout of a firm, the cutting of public spending on a university, or whatever it might be, plunges you into precariousness. And the point is that anyone can become a member of the precariat quite easily. The division of labor has become such that only a very few people are privileged enough to sort of enjoy a kind of security of contract and pay that puts them in a more secure position vis-a-vis this expanding precariat globally. I think this is an argument, actually, although you might think, oh, that's an argument for building personal resilience, I actually think it's an argument against a constant focus on resilience. The reason is this, it's a very simple one, but it's like there are educators all over the world, there are certainly students and people all over the world that are struggling to build resilience. But what are we all doing it for if we're just going to plunge all those people into competition against each other? And that's kind of what's happening. And someone's got to lose in that competition, and other people win. So resilience is, if it's individualized in this way, isn't going to get us all that far. It has literally very limited benefits. The other person I want to mention as an inspiration in this area is a very different kind of thinker, and much more of a philosopher, is Judith Butler. And in the wake of 9/11, she wrote a very wonderful book called Precarious Life that said, instead of taking the path of a militaristic response, which we unfortunately did in the US to the acts of terror, what they could have done is reminded people both here and around the world of how fragile human life is, how anybody's life can be taken away. So many people can get Alzheimer's out of the blue. Life is precarious. And she dwells on this philosophically and says that rather than sort of turn to a kind of universal declaration of rights or something like that, perhaps it's through the ongoing constant reflection on the precariousness of life that we can build the respect for other people that's necessary for building collaborative, solidaristic responses to precarity. And I think there's a lot of value in that argument. So I think together that the conclusion I would draw from that is that we need to rethink the forms of individualized, personalized responsibility that we're constantly told in these market-oriented times that we have to develop to survive. You know, save your personal pension, be responsible, take responsibility for your life, you know, get an education and get a job. We need to be able to turn that around and talk about collective response abilities. How do we develop the abilities collectively to respond? How do we move from personal responsibilization to collective responsibility? Now, Rich has asked me for a couple of questions that we could move to deliberation on. And really my questions relate to what I've just outlined. How do we move and how do we do more to help people move from precarity to solidarity? How does that actually happen? So that's my one guiding question for you to think about. And the second is, what kinds of responsibilities in that new spelling I'm suggesting here, responsibilities, actually what are the abilities to respond that we need to develop given the planetary dynamics that are producing precariousness? There's so many of these planetary processes that we could list. You're going to hear about them in this the talk that you were mentioning on ice, and certainly global climate change is one very all-encompassing kind of precariousness that very clearly shows human beings that they're in this together. But there are many other kinds of planetary processes producing precarity, global arms trading, unsustainable agricultural practices, as well as global financial and economic volatility and dispossession. So what are the best ways to develop a response to all those planetary processes that produce precariousness. I think if we can start answering those questions, then we're in a better place for thinking about how we can build a form of resistance that will really succeed and won't be just pie in the sky struggle against inequality in the abstract. So those are my questions. I hope those are useful ones.